Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Marta Sotakova, and I am the current president of the Slovak American Society of Washington, D.C. On behalf of the Slovak American Society of Washington, it's my pleasure to welcome you to our next speaker series. The SASW is a cultural organization dedicated to preserving and promoting Slovak heritage in the United States. Through social events, educational programs, and community gatherings, we connect people of Slovak descent and foster a deeper appreciation for Slovakia's rich traditions, history, and culture. If you're joining us for the first time, or if you are not a member yet, please consider becoming one. Your support helps us continue to bring your events like this and many others that would not be possible without our community. Today's program explores the evolution of Slovak wedding traditions in America and how they reflect the broader immigrant experience over the past 140 years. It is my honor to introduce our speaker, Joe Bielecki, or in English, Joe Bielecki. Mr. Bielecki is a practicing attorney in Pennsylvania and a longtime leader in cultural and educational organizations. He serves as a president of the National Council and Sokol USA and has been actively involved with the Czechoslovak Room Committee at the University of Pittsburgh for many years. His work in intercultural exchange has been recognized by the U.S. Department of State. At the end of the presentation, we'll open the floor for Q&A. In the meantime, feel free to submit your questions using the chat and we'll address them during the Q&A session. Please join me in welcoming Joe Bielecki. Okay, Joe, the floor's yours.
Well, thank you very much, Martha.
And if I missed anything, just correct me.
No problem. It's nice to, unfortunately, I'm not in front of you all, so I can't say it's nice to meet you all because we're not in person, but it's nice to be here to have the chance to talk to your group and to kind of show how what we think of as a Slovak wedding in America is something that has morphed and changed virtually completely since the 1880s. And truly, I think by the end of our chat today, everyone will see how greatly weddings have changed from Slovakia to America. And in order to do that, we need to kind of understand Slovakia in the 1880s and set the stage for the people who emigrated from Slovakia to the US. So what was Slovakia like? Well, actually, please put the first slide on. And yeah, perfect. Okay. So if you could go to the first slide, Helen, because I'm not seeing the visual. It's the slide with the immigrant gentleman.
Yeah, it just shows his name, Helen. We're not done with problems.
Okay. Oh,
For the benefit of our audience, while Helen is pulling up the first
this
of the
new
visuals.
update on Zoom is just not friendly.
Yeah, we had quite a lot of issues even getting connected today. So just bear with us because of the tech end of the Zoom things. It's we've had a bunch of little frustrations even just getting here. Perfect. Okay. So these are pictures of go back to the gentleman, please. Yes, okay.
It's sensitive if you click at once.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
These gentlemen are in front of a boarding house on Pittsburgh's South Side in 1903. And the boarding house is actually the building is still there. It's maybe a block from where I'm seated to give this lecture. But when you look at this image, what do you see? You see generally young men. They're not wealthy. At least you can see that from the way they're dressed. And these were the very early immigrants from generally from much of Eastern Europe, but Slovakia in particular. They started coming in the 1880s. They were generally young. They were generally men. They were generally from very rural areas. This doesn't mean city people didn't come, but what was driving, there were two things driving emigration. In the 1880s to about 1905, a lot of the emigration to America was driven by economics. Slovakia was not a very, much of Slovakia was not a very rich agricultural area. The people who were emigrating tended to be from very poor regions, very mountainous regions that were not conducive to agriculture because in the south, for example, as one neared the Hungarian plain, the lands were very fertile and people grew crops. They had vineyards. They were actually fairly well off in many ways because of the rich farming land. But much of Slovakia was mountainous. People herded sheep. They were a lot of people were employed as woodcutters, doing lumber jacking work in the forests in the mountains. And so when they heard about the possibility of this rich land called America, many people decided to go. And they went for a variety of reasons. Some went to make some money and return. Some went with the idea of not coming back at all, and others kind of went and tried their luck, and maybe it didn't work out, and they returned home. There were a whole variety of motivations and experiences, but generally the people were very young because they were going to go and do labor, and that kind of emigration wasn't good for middle-aged people. The elderly couldn't support themselves. And these gentlemen that you see in this slide, most of them would have had no more than a third grade education. That was actually a bigger education than their neighbors further east. In the Habsburg Empire, under Franz Josef, the focus was they wanted everybody in the kingdom to be able to at least read and write at a third grade level. And they promoted universal literacy to that degree. And the idea was that, much of the constituent members of the empire, the Habsburg Empire, were involved in agricultural work. They really didn't need to know, trigonometry and algebra and things like that. They didn't need to know literature. They needed to be able to write their names, read at a basic level so that if there was some instruction book, for example, with something they had to work with, they could at least read and understand. But the primary focus of their jobs were agricultural things, or, for example, the lumberjacks, the need for literacy beyond a certain elementary level really wasn't necessary. So probably the vast bulk of these people in this photograph were done with their educational careers by the third grade. And to give you an illustration, in this same time as this photo is from about 1905, 1906. At that same time, there were only 4 high schools in all of Slovakia. And there were 4 million people in Slovakia. Now think about where you are right now, like here in Western Pennsylvania, which has, say, a 50-mile radius around Pittsburgh. There's about 1.5 million people, and there's probably 100 or more high schools. And Slovakia was several times the size of this region here, and they had only 4 high schools in 1905. So it gives you kind of an idea. There were no universities in Slovakia either at that point. Komeneus University became the first one that was founded after the end of World War I. So if people wanted a higher level of education, they had to go somewhere else, like to Prague or one of the larger cities like Vienna, Budapest, Berlin, somewhere to get um, a more advanced education. But for these guys who came here as the immigrants, this was the general profile at the beginning. Young men, rural backgrounds, third grade education at most. And what did they do once they got here? In America, they were doing one of 2 things. In the big cities, they were doing factory work. For example, Pittsburgh is the steel city. So these young guys were doing a lot of the entry-level manufacturing jobs at the steel mills. Or there were regions like in southwestern Pennsylvania, central Pennsylvania, northeastern Pennsylvania that were coal mining areas. And many of the rural people went to work in these coal mining towns. You didn't need any particular skills to do the labor these guys were doing wherever they were, whether they were in the city or in the countryside, in the coal mines, they were generally doing heavy labor. Closer to 1900 and later, young women started coming. At the beginning, the early immigrants from Slovakia were, as I said, mostly men because they were coming looking to do heavy labor, save up money, and return home. For example, like many of them would come for a year or two, save up some money, and then return home and buy a plot of land for a small farm. Or maybe they wanted to save some money and build a house when they returned. You know, they were kind of not necessarily, the vast majority of the very early ones weren't here for the long haul. And so as time passed, then young ladies started coming, and they were coming to do something different than the men. The young ladies were coming often to do what the term in those days was domestic service. These days we would call them maids or nannies. They would work in the homes of people who were a bit better off, either doing cleaning, serving as laundresses, working as cooks or nannies. And they would do the same thing as the men, would make some money, often return. And with the passage of time, things began to change. Just as a footnote, roughly half of the people who came from Slovakia ended up returning home, whether as successes or as failures. But only about half of the immigrants through this whole time frame, 1880 to 1920, actually stayed. We're going to move on to the next slide. And you'll see this is a little village called Popin. It is in the Udava River Valley in the far northeast of Slovakia. This town, as you can see the mountains and the forests. And that illustrates kind of what people were doing. This wasn't really much of a farming village per se. The town has essentially became almost depopulated during the immigration to America years of 1880 to 1920. And in fact, it has never since 1912 reached 3,000 residents. That was its peak, and it was nothing but a kind of a source of emigres, and even today it hasn't reached 3,000 people. That was, but it's an illustration of, how rural these villages were, very, very poor. And next slide, please. Okay. And often, the only like one tall building like the church, everybody else was in small, crowded little housing. Next, please. This is an example of the interior of one of the peasant cottages in the village. If you've ever read stories or folk tales, you would encounter phrases like they slept on the stove in the winter. They would actually put down like wooden planking on top of this big earthen. You see the earthen stove, and it's heated by either coal or burning logs. And in the dead of winter, they would put on the big flat platform wooden boards and sleep on top of the stove to stay warm. This is and it's the same in like Ukraine and Russia at those times as well. And so this is an example of the interior of one of the homes that one of these emigres would have left over time. So you see kind of the background these people had, and also, for example, these villages, they had only outhouses. There was no running water. Running water didn't reach many of these villages in the far east of Slovakia till the 1970s. Electricity came in the 30s. And so it was a very, very different world in the 1880s to 1920s. You can imagine, how the living conditions were. Next slide, please. In the peak year of emigration to America, which was 1912, there were 10 million people that came to the United States through Ellis Island. It's like incredible. And they would generally get, when their ships docked at Ellis Island, and they'd be dressed in their finest clothing, which were, folk costumes. We would use the term croy. They wore their Sunday best, thinking, hey, this is great. We're coming to this new world. And they would get out at Ellis Island. They had to go through a medical exam, and then they would go by a ferry to the main part of Manhattan where they could connect to the train station. And what would happen when they arrived? So they would go to the train station, and lo and behold, they had their first really kind of culture shock in America, because, of course, they're surrounded by all these people who looked completely different from them. They weren't wearing croy. These Americans were wearing American clothes. They looked so different. The immigrants felt like they were wearing Halloween costumes in a way. I mean, one of the first things they did when they got to their destinations was to get American style clothes, because, it was a whole different world. But imagine, they get on the trains, they come to their destinations. For example, in the city of Pittsburgh, 20,000 newcomers a day were arriving by train from the ports, from New York. 20,000 people a day. And most of them were like these guys that we saw in front of the boarding house on the south side. Young, they didn't know English, not well educated. They could barely read and write in their own languages. They had no clue. And they get out of the trains. And what do they see? This is the view from 1905 at the Pennsylvania trains, at the train station in downtown Pittsburgh. This was a daytime shot. The sky was so polluted that if you look way in the background, you can see the street lights are on. And this is like noon or 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And these guys walk out of the train station. I remember there was an older woman some years ago who had, she and I were talking, and she and her husband came from after the Second World War. And she said they got out of the train station and she turned to her husband and said, Yoy, Laszlo, what did we do? This is how dirty and polluted, and this is your typical big city in America, industrial city. And there were huge components of culture shock. You know, what do you see at the end of the portico of the train station? You see cars, and they didn't see those things in Europe. They had streetlights. They had these high power locomotives that actually took them to Pittsburgh. And, as they walked further and further, everything was something new. It was as if they had been catapulted a couple of centuries into Silicon Valley today. I mean, it was, imagine digesting all of this as you come out of the train station. Everything would be not just different, but like some high-tech wonder and marvel. Let's go to the next slide. And this is downtown Pittsburgh, again, from the train station. And you can see the tall buildings, which they would not have had anything like this, not even in the big cities in Slovakia. So they saw skyscrapers, they saw electric lights, they saw streetcars. Next slide, please. And there you see it, the streetcars, the automobiles, the skyscrapers, it's all in one shot. And imagine you've walked out the door with your mentality was, you were never exposed to anything like this. And you had to figure out how to get to where you were going in the city and what to do. And it was an enormous impression and also an enormous cultural shock. Next, please. Okay, this is here in the south side of Pittsburgh, uh, roughly at that time period, maybe a few years later. And you can see electric wires. There was already electrification to some of the houses. You see that automobiles didn't become affordable in working class neighborhoods till much, much later in time, like say the 1930s or so, but there was someone on the street who had a car. And generally, these people were living in overcrowded housing. Because a lot of these fellows were coming to do temporary labor, they often would move in with a family and be boarders. And they would have an arrangement. Maybe there would be like 3 or 4 guys in bunk beds in a room, and the lady of the house that they were boarders in would fill their lunch buckets with food for them to take to eat at work, and do the washing once a week for them, and these guys would save money. That's how they would save the money. They would become boarders and then live frugally and then send their money home by Western Union or so. Western Union in that time even was a huge operation. They could send money to relatives. They could send like vouchers for ship tickets to come, and many sorts of things. But again, for the people who were planning to return home, that's how they were able to save to do what they wanted to do when they got back home. So, and next slide, please. This is the south side of Pittsburgh. And you see the housing is really dense. There would often be 2 or 3 families in one of these row houses. Families then were a lot bigger. You would have parents and maybe 5 or 6 kids. And so imagine like each floor was a different family in these 3-story buildings and 2-story buildings. And so it was quite overcrowded. There was no indoor bathrooms at that time. And so there were outhouses in the courtyards of all these houses. There were also wells. And the interesting thing is you would have these crazy things like typhoid epidemics and waterborne illness epidemics because the outhouses would leach into the wells. So by the 1910s and 20s, the cities began to solve the problem of these epidemics that were happening. It was happening everywhere in the United States. New York was the first city to figure it out, and they started doing at least the canalization of water to the buildings so that people wouldn't drink contaminated water and spread these illnesses. Pittsburgh started doing it in the 20s. So, but this gives you an idea of how they were living when they got here. And next slide. And these are kids playing in, this is an industrial suburb of Pittsburgh called Homestead. And you can see the smokestacks from the steel factories. And these little kids were playing in the courtyard. The 3 boys are sitting on top of an outhouse and their buddies are hanging out on the fence in front of the shed. But as you can see, they were not living the rich life here. These were people who were poor. The conditions were harsh. A guy who worked, for example, in a steel factory or a coal mine doing heavy labor, and these were considered bottom level jobs. Like these were jobs that the Americans generally would not take in the same time period. These days, industrial laborers are paid fairly well. Back then, they were not. It was the starting point for a lot of newcomers to do heavy labor in factories and then try and improve their status by working up to do something else that was less arduous and better paid. But the fathers of these kids would be earning $4 a week for heavy labor, and the workday was not a 40-hour work week. The work week was about a 10-hour workday. In these hot, dirty factories. A steel factory, if you work in a steel factory or a glass factory, you'll drink a couple gallons of water in the course of your shift because the heat is very difficult on the laborer. But anyway, let's go to the next slide. This is in Pittsburgh, and you see the courtyard in between a couple of buildings, and in the center of it, you see the outhouses, and there would generally be a hand pump to a well, and the people would draw their water from the well, the pump and the well in the courtyard. There would be these little outhouses that would serve all the buildings, and you see the conditions that the people were living in. This is all roughly the 1900 to 1910. Next slide, please. This is a coal mine house. And this is actually my mom was the one who took this photo years later. She grew up, my grandparents had come and they were working in the coal fields. And this was a little town near Latrobe, Pennsylvania. The company that owned the coal mines owned all the houses, and they would rent out the houses to 2 families. They were designed for 2 different families to kind of each live in half of the house. And this is how they looked at that time. On the right in the front is an outhouse. You see the white building is where 2 families would live. And then on the left-hand side, that was yet another building, in the coal mining town. But the coal mine companies made the workers pay them to rent the houses. There were generally transportation wasn't so easy, so that there was a company store, and the companies would, had like a general store where they would sell them things. And in many instances, these people didn't have much left at the end of the week after they paid for their housing and their food, etc. And they were, like that old country western song, I owed my soul to the company store, because a lot of these company stores would advance credit and then offset it against their wages, and they had virtually nothing at the end of the day. But that's another story in and of itself. The next slide, please. This is inside a steel factory in Pittsburgh in this same time period. So imagine the young guys in the first photograph who had recently left these rural villages, and they're coming to work in what was high-tech America at that time. And every day was experiences they had never encountered before. They're working with tools, they're working with molten metal, they're working with electricity, all kinds of marvels that they had never seen before. And these were multinational crews. The companies would just hire indiscriminately these young immigrant guys. So you'd be maybe in a crew with guys from Italy and Poland and Serbia and Ukraine and Bulgaria, and and you'd wonder, how did they communicate? But they always had a boss who was an Anglo speaker, whether they were Irish or from one of the other Anglo countries. And the Anglo speaker would kind of make it understood to them what they had to do. And so these guys ended up with a vocabulary of certain words that they knew enough of to do their jobs from day to day, from the shift boss. Next slide, please. And you see the marvels. These guys are pouring liquid metal, liquid steel into ingot molds and things. I mean, imagine what was going on in their heads, having come from such rural environments and getting tossed into this right away. Next slide. And this is another illustration of the mental transformation that was happening with them. This is a cogwheel in one of the factories. And if you look at the bottom right, you see the 6-foot-tall guy standing next to the piece of equipment that they're working on. And it must have just really been something very unfathomable at first. If you imagine, you've come from the ship, the train station, your relatives find you some employments, you start like in a few days, and you're suddenly starting with this. I mean, it was a whole catapulting into a different world. Next slide, please. This is one of the steel factories in Pittsburgh. This is in the south side of Pittsburgh. This factory employed 20,000 people. The factories lined both sides of the river and went for about 10 to 15 miles in either direction. And this is just one of them. And it must have been really quite an amazing impression for these guys when they first arrived. And this is sort of setting the stage, because you have to see the conditions and how they were living in order to understand how the weddings and everything transformed itself. So we'll go to our next slide, and we will be spending more time on fewer images because we'll be talking about things in these images. This is an old country wedding. And the image isn't the best quality. I mean, the underlying photograph is so old. It was from about 1905 or so. And even in Europe, things were beginning to change. But what do we see in this photo? In the center, we see the young couple. On either side are their parents. In the background are musicians. These would have been like gypsy musicians. And weddings were done in Europe at that time quite differently from here. The weddings were in villages were often 3 days long. They would start with the young couple being escorted by the musicians and the whole wedding party on foot through the village to the church where the ceremony would take place. They often wore their kroy or folk costumes. This couple was a bit more modern at an early time. You see the white wedding dress and the veil. The normal custom for a young woman getting married would be they would wear their kroy, and the woman to be the bride, she would wear a floral wreath in her hair. And at a certain stage during the wedding, the floral wreath would be replaced by a special cap or a headpiece that the married women would wear. And if you were a young girl, you couldn't wear the headpiece until you were actually married. And so there would be like a transition ceremony, but we'll get to that in a little bit. This couple, you see the bride is wearing a white wedding dress. Queen Victoria set the stage at her wedding for what became the standard white wedding gown with veil. Apparently, it was such a fashion statement, it caught on like wildfire all over Europe. Prior to Queen Victoria, the rich ladies would wear gowns, and they could be any color they wanted and any style they wanted. And it was Queen Victoria who started the trend to the white wedding dress, white symbolizing purity, etc., and the veil. The veil signified modesty, and at a certain point during the ceremony, the veil would be lifted so you could see the bride's face. But Queen Victoria, this couple in 1905 was doing the Queen Victoria style wedding dress, which is very interesting. This is from way in the East. And it's really amazing that at that point, that transition was happening. But again, the weddings would be 3 days long. The couple would be escorted to church by gypsy bands. Prior to the wedding, the couple had to come up, or the bride had to come up with a dowry, and there was a ceremonial exchange of the dowry. Often it involved money and livestock. If they were in agricultural villages, the bride's father would have to give the groom's family, so many sheep or cattle. The bride was expected to come with a large chest, kind of like, not like a cedar chest that we would envision today, but like a very large chest, big enough to contain her whole trousseau, like a couple sets of complete bedding, like sheets, pillowcases, a duvet, or feather bed, some pots, pans, cutlery, crockery, and basically she had her dowry chest was containing the contents of everything sufficient to set up house at a certain elementary level. So that was required, and the richer the bride's family were, the more additional things came in addition to the dowry chest, like the livestock or money or things of that nature. The ceremony, the reception would generally be 3 days long of eating, feasting, dancing, drinking, and it was this long party. That was one of the first things that was phased out in America. And that was for a reason, which we will get to soon. But also, when these people processed through the village to the church, often there would be, the kids, people would stretch ribbons across their path that they'd have to cut through the ribbons and progress to the church for the ceremony. And so they were whole very different affairs. They were like gigantic parties. Pretty much, the villages were small places. Most of the people knew each other and would attend the weddings. And it was like a 3-day party for the people in the village. Now, when they got to America, that's where all these changes really, really began. And we're going to go to the next slide, and we're going to see some of the changes happening. Okay, these people are in America. This is an early 1900s wedding. And if you look closely at the photo, the bride is in full-blown Queen Victoria, but this is a little bit interesting spin. She still has a floral wreath on top of the wedding veil. This one, I believe, at that time, a lot of the East European immigrant women would have these little floral wreaths made out of like silk or cloth flowers, and they would weave it into the white bridal veil headpiece. But generally, these kind of weddings were not very big here. People were coming without their families because older people couldn't do the physical work that was expected of these entry-level new immigrants. It was too demanding. So you had mostly young people coming without families. And you see this small group. This is pretty much the entire wedding party. There are no parents there. The parents of these couples were all in Europe, and you had an unusual role evolve here. And that role lasted till sometime by the end of the First World War. You had the young couple would ask an older couple to be substitutes for their parents. And they were called the starosta and the starostkina, like kind of the older ones. But these wedding godparents, they did a variety of functions. First, they were there to be available to give the young couple advice, because these people needed to know how to not have children right away. So the woman would talk to the older lady and she'd tell her how not to have babies right away, or how to raise children, or give her some advices, once things like that came. But also a very important role for the starosta or starostkina was the couple. This era, there weren't places to hold the wedding parties. And especially like out in the countryside in these coal mining little company towns, these were small collections. Maybe there'd be 100 houses, and there would be no facilities of any sort. And the starosta and the starostkina were usually an older couple, where the younger couple would ask them. They would give them this honor being the wedding parents, but the expectation was that they would use their house, like their kitchen or their living room, for the party afterwards. So they'd take out the furniture, put it somewhere, and they'd have their drinking and dancing, because you see, like these people, these weren't big affairs. There probably weren't many more people at this wedding than those in this photograph, because generally people were coming without most of their families. In fact, if someone came with a sibling, that was maybe it. But generally, these people were coming alone. And so they had a few friends. These weren't big affairs in a sense. Like today, it's not like you have a guest list with 200 people. You'd have a couple of your buddies. The bride would have couple of her girlfriends that she knew from working here, and the same with the groom. And so the people who were asked to lend their home to host the reception, they knew they weren't going to get 200 people. It would be it would be a small crowd. And of course, then people would prepare the food, everything would be ready in advance. And so the wedding godparents were also people who had at least a place that could serve as the venue for the post-wedding ceremony party, which was important. The party shrank down to being one, like an afternoon or an evening total. It wasn't a 3-day affair like in Europe, because of course they all had to go to work and they were poor. They didn't have a great deal of money to make a gigantic party. So you see the wedding contracting in its time frame. By the First World War, there were enough people starting to, people would meet someone from another country here. Like you'd be living, say, in the big city, and you'd meet a woman from Bulgaria, or a Slovak girl would meet a guy from Italy, and they'd get married and they'd stay. And so, the composition, there were intermarriages with other ethnic groups, and also because they were staying, by the end of the First World War, by the 20s, you had people who were already having families and making the decision not to return home. And so by the 1920s and 30s, a lot of you saw the rise of wedding halls. A lot of the churches built social halls because they needed a place for their people to congregate for parties like wedding parties or funeral lunches. The sheer numbers of people who'd stayed had outgrown the ability for somebody to be a starosta or staroskina and lend their living room or their kitchen for the wedding party. And probably those people who had been starosta and staroskina were actually, in a sense, glad that they weren't hosting wedding parties anymore, because, of course, that was a big imposition. But, the sheer size of the family units led to the rise of these social clubs, for example, like a lot of places you'd see the Italian American club or the Slovak club or the Polish club, and they would actually, make money by building these halls. And like I see the one comment, the Sokol Club, that's exactly so. Those clubs existed in part, they financed themselves by having a facility available to rent out for these kind of events. And that was good for everybody. And also the role of the substitute parents disappeared because now people were here, say by the 1920s, the people who had come in 1900 and stayed, their kids were old enough and getting married, so they didn't need stand-ins for the wedding parents or for the staros, because the parents themselves were here. And so, the role of starosta and staroskina kind of started to fall by the wayside by the end of World War I as well. Let's go to the next slide. This slide is from a 1913 wedding in coal mine country. And the young couple in the center are actually my grandparents. Everybody looks really serious in this photo because, not that they were all having a bad time, but early photography, you had to stand really still for the photo to register nicely on the film. So everybody always looks, in these early photos, always looks kind of stern. And you see sitting on stools are an old man and an older woman. Those were a starosta and a staroskina, because all of the parents for the couple were in Europe. And so these were examples of the wedding godparents. There's only one person in this whole, this is everybody who was at this wedding, by the way. If you look at the groom, you see a hand on his shoulder, that a guy in the back row has put his hand on this fellow's shoulder. That is the brother of the groom. And he's the only person there that was related to either the bride or the groom. So this illustrates as well the fact that, these people were coming. There were no family units in general coming to these things. These were mostly single people coming on their own, meeting someone, wanting to get married, etc. So, you see this photo illustrates a great deal of the things that we've talked about. And so the parties then began to change. If you go to the next slide, this is from much later, say about 10 years or so later, in the 20s, possibly 30s, maybe 20s, because the skirts of the ladies were longer. But this is actually outside a Czech and Slovak social club on the north side of Pittsburgh. And it shows the rise of the hall or club as a wedding venue. And, and at this point, many other things are changing. The music isn't gypsy music anymore. It's, whatever pop music is, these days it would be like Madonna and a lot of these other singers, Beyonce. Back then it would have been in the 20s, foxtrots and Charlestons, and you'd have bands playing popular music. So the weddings morph and morph and morph as they go in America. And what you have by now, by the 30s and 40s, and even today, has very little resemblance. If you look at a reception, for example, in Europe, at the wedding reception in a village for a young couple, there would have been a certain point during the festivities where all of the older women would be called up. They'd make a big circle, and there would be a ceremony where the young girl, who was the bride, would have her floral wreath removed from her head, and the older women would put on the special cap that married women would wear in these villages. The cap was called a chepets, and this was a big ceremony. It marked the transition into like the life of going from being a young girl, the young maiden, to a mature married woman. And the women would sing songs, or somebody would recite a poem, dealing with this kind of morphing into the new married woman life. And they would put the ceremonial cap on the bride's head. That was done away with completely in America. Because one of the first things that happened as soon as people left Ellis Island was they got rid of the croy. They got rid of the full costumery. But there's a morph on this. If you think back to weddings post-World War II, you'd always see a circle around a bride, and it would be people singing, and there would be a bridesmaid holding an apron. And you were expected to put at least $1 bill in the apron, and you would have a little circle dance with the bride. And what would happen was the idea was this replaced the capping ceremony. The young couple would need money to get started. And so the circle was similar to what was in Europe traditionally, but there was no capping ceremony. There was this dance with the bride, and the bridesmaid would hold the apron. You'd have a little turn on the dance floor with the bride, and she'd get a little money. And if you were a man, they gave you a shot of whiskey. If you were a lady, they gave you a nice little slice of wedding cake. And that was to get the young couple started. And in America, the groom would try to break through the circle and snatch the bride away, because that's actually what would happen in Europe at the end of the capping ceremony. The groom had to break through the circle of women and carry off his bride, and that would mark the end of the festivities. And so here they did away with the capping ceremony, and you had the circle of the people in the wedding in general. It wasn't just the married women like in Europe. And they would be singing a song. And I don't know if, and there are actually words to this song. It was the tune goes da 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 da. And the words to it basically are what they would have sung in these capping ceremonies. And the gist of the tune and the gist of the words are, whose bride is she? She is still ours. And it's going on because this is the point where the groom is supposed to break through the circle of people and snatch the bride and carry her off to his home, and they start their lives together. And so that's why, they say, whose bride is she? She's still ours. And there are other similar lines to that effect in the lyric. And, the tune has stayed the same, which is a very interesting phenomenon, actually, if you think about it, because they've done away with virtually the entire ceremony and turned it into what they call the dollar dance, but they kept the tune. And some people still know the words, and the words have less, but the words have the same relevance. The groom has to break through the circle of people who are singing around this bride and snatch her away, and that marks the end of the wedding. But we have some other things too. Next slide. Now you see the post-wedding bower of bliss. This is what it's all about, to get to the marital status. You see the washing machine in the kitchen, the table, the really American-looking steelworker house. You see the dad shaving in the mirror at the kitchen sink. The little kids are there. The wife is cooking the dinner on the stove. And this is the culmination, right? You've made it. You've gotten married, etc. But there were interesting stories too. Like, I also have some visual things to show you, and I will hold them up in front of. I'm going to ask this question to Marta and Helen, who are running the slideshow. So if I want to show something, do I just hold it up in front of me and they'll see it?
You should be able to just hold it in front of your camera and your
Very,
phone camera.
Yeah, now they should be able to see it.
okay, very good.
I paused the
Okay, I will show you some things from Europe that used to be wedding gifts versus how they changed in America. In Europe, your mother and your sisters and everybody from when you were a teenager would start to be making your trousseau. This is actually a pillowcase for a young married lady's trousseau, because of course you were expected to come with the dowry chest full of things to start your marital life, like tablecloths, the pillowcases, blankets, sheets. Here's another example, a fancy tablecloth to put on. Bear with me. Yes, a fancy tablecloth to put on your kitchen table in your new home. Similarly, and here's another example, and the bride and her sisters would be preparing all of these things for months and months before the wedding. And these were examples of the gifts. And also, of course, if there are things that the bride had created, it's to show her handiwork and her creativity, and that she will be a wonderful, dutiful wife, that she can make and sew things like this tablecloth, for example. You can see all the fine detail work in it. And these were kind of the classic gifts, and also things that they were expected to come with. And here's some more examples. Your mother or grandmother would crochet these kind of things as part of your trousseau. And there's an unusual item I have here. Okay, you see this icon. Often there were either icons or holy pictures in homes, and the families would create these textiles that would be wrapped around the holy picture. And I'm going to try and do this one-handed to illustrate this, but these were often wedding gifts as well. Yeah, I can do this. So you could see, the picture, of course, would be nailed up on the wall, and the cloth would be hanging or draped around it. This isn't the best illustration, to do one-handed for you, but you can see it. Now, in America, things morphed. For example, I have two of the wedding gifts from the 1913 wedding of my grandparents in the coal mining town. Grandma's best friend, this was like grandma's big treasure, this little wee kind of coffee cup, and this dish with a hand-painted fish on the bottom. Her best friend saved money and went to the store and bought a store-bought gift, because generally people were giving at these kind of weddings here practical things, like they would make feather stuffed pillows or feather stuffed pejina or duvet, where they would make the same kind of things, pillowcases, tablecloths, things that the young couple needed, because you were alone here. You had nobody to help you make this dowry chest full of stuff. So the wedding gifts morphed, and people brought things to the wedding they thought you would need, like pots and pans, cutlery, crockery of different usefulness, things, different size, ceramic containers, things to set you up in the house as a household, because your family wasn't here to help you do this or to create these things. This is an example of a wedding gift from my mom's wedding. And of course, with the passage of time, things got, now, you think things are pretty extravagant, right? My mom's uncle gave her a percolator in 1953, and this stovetop percolator was considered a nice wedding gift in 1953. Now, they would give you a microwave, or they would give you something fancy, or or an envelope with a couple $100 in cash. But things kept changing here too. And a lot of times the young couple would register in the modern era, like these days, they register at a department store, and they have lists of what they want the people to get for them. So even things like the gifts have morphed over time. And now you even have couples making these destination wedding trips, which that's a whole nother story. Like, oh, let's not get married here. Let's go off to Aruba and get married on the beach. That's a whole different thing. And I have a funny story to share with you. There is a young Slovak artist in her late 20s, early 30s, who's living in America. Her name's Katerina Yanechkova Walsh. And she has kind of she married an American guy, a guy from Corpus Christi, Texas. And a lot of her art depicts her transition to married life in America and her American husband's transition to life with Katerina. So she marries this guy. He's like this real Anglo-Texas kind of cowboy kind of guy. And they first get married and he has no clue. He tells her to do the laundry and she's like, well, why can't you do it? That was his wake-up call, right? But then she started realizing there were so many things this Texas cowboy had no idea to do in domestic life. She started making it a theme of her art. So here we see Katerina and the husband, the Texas cowboy, with the experience of doing the laundry. He didn't even know how to take the laundry to the laundromat, right? He expected her to do it. And she's like, no, pal, you got to wake up. You got to start learning to do stuff. And so you see this much more vividly here in this photo, the laundry experience. And then, of course, Katerina introduces him. Here's the American husband having finally learned to do the laundry with the washing machine. This is all from a book of her artworks that she has published in the States. And she even got him to the point where here's him doing the ironing. He didn't even know what an iron was. That was like something he expected her to do. And he got the wake-up call, like, this is the 2020s, pal. You got to be really with it and learn to do things too. And so you had the culture shock between his world and her world, Texas and Slovakia, cowboys and more feminist women. It was a very interesting thing. But her artwork is full of examples of adjustments to the new world and the new world's adjustment to Katerina too. So it's very interesting. Her book is called The Secrets of a Happy Household. So anyway, you can see everything has morphed in America. There's so many things that have changed. One thing that also has morphed is the wedding food that you have at the reception. Mostly the menu is like American banquet hall food, except at a lot of Slovak weddings, you'll still see halupki, the pigs in the blanket, the meat rolls, or kielbasa. But generally, you'll have like fried chicken and some kind of pasta. The whole wedding menu's changed here, etc. So what started in the 1880s as the classic Slovak wedding has become something really completely different in America. And you do have a few holdovers from the original time frame. Some of the food items, the circle and the song around the bride at the end of the wedding is the same. But the purpose of it has totally changed. The groom still has to break through the circle and carry off the bride, but that would have been part of the whole capping ceremony, which that was done away with even before the First World War in America. So many things have changed and a few things remain the same. And so if anyone has questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Yes, everyone. The floor is open. There's a couple of chat things. I don't know if you can read it.
Let's see. I see. Okay.
I can read it if you need me to.
Let's see. Yeah. I have to keep scrolling to see these things.
Yeah, it's just Ronald said one set of grandparents returned in 1914 and bought a farm, built a log house. 1960s, my aunt built a new brick house that had a plumbing fixtures. I first visited in 1970. In 1996, they finally got running water in the house.
Yeah, yeah. And you know, in one sense, the 70s is when a lot of these rural villages started seeing running water and indoor bathrooms. And it's not surprising because these villages were so poor and so much of the country was so rural. It was, you know, you had to figure out where to start. And electrification started in the 30s in the east of Slovakia. The big cities had it much earlier, but rural electrification was happening almost at the same time Franklin Roosevelt was taking power lines down through West Virginia and Appalachia and all these small towns, even here in Pennsylvania. A lot of these towns an hour outside of Pittsburgh, a lot of these little clusters of homes along the roadways and things didn't have electricity till the 30s. It was very interesting because there was a big physical cost of erecting the poles and stringing the lines and the cables and then connecting the houses. And so they generally did the big cities first because it was cheaper and easier to do that. And then, you know, over time, they kind of filled in the rest of the power grid in a sense. And the same thing, it was the same thing happening over there in Europe too. And by the 30s, say like by the end of the 30s, just as the Second World War would start, pretty much all of rural America was electrified and all of rural Czechoslovakia was electrified too. And I once saw an argument, it was the funniest thing, like in my mind as a child or a teenager, it was the funniest thing. We had these neighbors and they had come after World War II from Europe. And the woman was from Zakarpatska and the husband was from Hungary. And they would get into these odd arguments. And one of their arguments was whose village had light bulbs first? And I remember hearing her say to her husband, Eugene, we were in Czechoslovakia. We were modern. We had light bulbs in 1936. And you were in Hungary and you didn't get them till much later. Oh, and they had this crazy argument over who had light bulbs first in their village, right? And you just think about like, wow, what an impression that was to like somebody, you know, like here, we wouldn't even think about things like that, you know, about not having them.
Yeah. There's another one from John where when my mom's dad came in 1914, he searched for a girl from a particular village that was just next to his. Was it common for immigrants to seek out mates from the original village or one close by?
Yes and no. I mean, a lot of times, you know, in a few years ago, the term chain migration was being talked about. And that's like where somebody comes from their village to America and then they send for relatives and their relatives bring their relatives over. And it's sort of like, you know, the chain as of how these people are coming. And a lot of times people felt more comfortable marrying someone from their own town or their own region because they could be understood easier. Like, you know, imagine it would be difficult, say, if you married an Italian woman, you don't have a common cultural ground to start with. She's cooking different things that you were never used to seeing, speaking a different language, having different experiences. And so it wasn't unusual for people to look for, I mean, some of these villages were so small, you wouldn't necessarily easily find someone from your own hometown, for example. But from your region, like say from the same county, you know, Slovakia lost over 20% of its population to emigration to America. And so the chances that you would find someone from at least your same part of the country was pretty high here. And people preferred to do that because there was no language barrier, there was no culture barrier than if you would have married a Bulgarian, for example. That's a different culture, different religion. They're Orthodox, and the Slovaks aren't necessarily so. So, it's not surprising that they preferred to find, but it didn't mean that they didn't marry from outside their region or their country, but it made it easier.
Yep. All right, we have a thank you from Sophie. Thank you so much. This was marvelous, as I am from the region on which you focused. I'm told my mother's wedding in the U.S. coal country was still a 3-day celebration.
Wow, that's unusual because, economically, it was hard to afford a 3-day wedding in America. That's why the 3-day wedding disappeared.
Unless the whole
early
village
on.
comes together and they cook together.
Well, yeah, but also these people were working,
Yeah.
and the companies gave them hard times for being off and things like that. It was a tougher thing here, but that's an interesting thing that they still had the 3-day wedding back then. That's quite an accomplishment.
Awesome. Yep. And then from Michael, in Nanty County, Pennsylvania,
Nanticoke. Yes, that's a famous coal mining area.
He said we went to a wedding and had to use an outdoor toilet as late as 1967.
Well, I'll share something with you. Many times, even in the big cities, the outhouses were around much longer than past the 1920s. Like the city of Pittsburgh sent around inspectors all over the city in the 60s and 70s. And this was really for hygiene reasons, like because these outhouses, the waste could leach into the underlying ground and the groundwater. And that's how the epidemics were happening in the early 1900s. And that's what led to them channeling the water in pipes to houses so that you wouldn't get sick from drinking well water. And so they actually went on the prowl searching for outhouses that had been overlooked when they were banning the outhouses. And in the neighborhood I'm living in, I have a little wee garage next door to my house. And when the lady sold me the house, she told me she got caught in 1973 having her outhouse. And the city made her install indoor toilets. And so where the outhouse was, she built the garage. And I was telling a friend of mine this story. He goes, "Oh, my grandparents lived on the south side, but up on the hillside. And they got caught in 1978 with their outhouse." So, things like that took a long time to eradicate, but the cities were much more forceful about it because they had the experiences in the early 1900s of epidemics that people got really sick and died from and things like that. And that's why they really pushed to get rid of these things in the big cities very early on. Cholera, for example, that was something that was happening in the 1880s and 1890s and was kind of eradicated in big city America by the early 1900s. And they discovered, the other things, typhoid and diphtheria and these things that are waterborne. That's when the cities put on the big push for, water piping, and the municipalities built the piping system and controlled it and forced everyone to hook up to it. And you can't now it would be unimaginable that somebody would get typhoid from the drinking water. But it was coming because the waste from the outhouses was leaching into the groundwater that was people used when they used the wells where they, put the bucket in and drew up the water. And so it was it was probably all for the best that this was done, but that's why it was done, actually.
Mhm.
And people didn't die, there weren't epidemics, and it's like it became unheard of by around the 1910, for example, because they eradicated this in large part.
Yep. We have a couple more. We have
Okay.
Miriam from Canada. I love this presentation. I live in Ontario, Canada, and I run a Slovak folklore dance group called Východná Slovak Dancers. Last year, we had a wonderful opportunity to travel to Slovakia with the show we created for our group's 40th anniversary. It told the story of a married man leaving Kraslavice, Medziany, and traveling to America, exploring the differences in people, culture, and dance. The main character faced a difficult dilemma whether to stay and earn money or return home to his wife with empty pockets. This year, we are preparing to perform the show again in Chicago this October in collaboration with the local dance group. If you're in the area, come and see us.
Oh, thank you. Thank
That's
you for the
awesome, Miriam.
invitation. And, it's very interesting what she had to say too. And I'll share a little funny story from my dad's side of the family. My dad's father always wanted to go back home, but he had gotten married and grandma didn't really want to go home. So they ended up having 13 children. Because every time he got close to having enough money to take them all back, she was pregnant again and he had to work more for another ship ticket till he finally just gave up.
All right, we have a one from Barbara.
Okay.
Thanks for your presentation. Might you be able to make any comments about how courtship may have different between Slovakia and here after immigration?
Well, here it was a big free-for-all because, like in Europe, you had, say in the late 1800s, you had matchmakers even. Like if you saw the movie Fiddler on the Roof, that wasn't just like matchmaking for Jewish people. They had matchmakers matchmaking people, other people in the village too. And they'd say, "Oh, well, I could get this guy to marry your daughter if you'd give a couple head of cattle, and she'd have a much more comfortable marriage with a husband that earns more money." And, or people's relatives try to arrange matches. But here, the 1880 to 1920, they weren't coming with their families. They were coming as single people, and they kind of had to figure it out on their own. Like, they'd go to dances and things at different venues, and your buddy would say, "Oh, that girl over there, look how she's looking at you. You should go take her out on the dance," right? That's how it starts, right? And then they go out, have a couple of dates, and they decide they like each other, and they'll get married. And because they had nothing, they were most of these people didn't even come with anyone from their families, so they had to kind of figure it out all on their own.
Yeah.
And find people on their own. And then that ties in with the earlier question from the lady about the marrying someone from the same town or the same region. It made it easier if you had somebody from at least your common culture. Like, so, the early days, the Slovaks, like a mixed marriage would be a Slovak and an Irish, for example, because they were two different cultures.
Yep.
And it was easier for a younger couple to at least be from the same culture or the same language group to function together.
Okay, we have a comment from Michael. 1830 and 1873 were the worst cholera epidemics in Slovakia. A colleague of mine, Jan Golian, writes about them.
Well, cholera was spread, that was spread through bad sanitation in general.
Yep.
And it took a long time. I mean, if you think about it, the idea of even vaccinations didn't come in until the very early 1800s. I think it was like right after the American Revolution. It was someone in, was it, I think the guy's name was Jenner. He was a medical doctor, but he, I believe, was friends with Thomas Jefferson. And this guy discovered how to immunize people against smallpox, because that was very deadly. And so, the level of knowledge was expanding. For example, it was the middle 1800s. There was a guy in Budapest. His name was Dr. Semmelweis. And he started wondering, why did so many women die in childbirth who were usually physically fit looking? And he discovered it was the midwives weren't washing their hands. And the women would get these bacterial infections that they would term post-birth infections. They've called the childbirth fever. And it was often fatal. And it was because, they were discovering lots of things. And it was Semmelweis who discovered that once you started making the conditions around the delivery more sanitary and sterile, and using things like clean sheets, and having the midwife and the doctor, wash their hands before the delivery, that it's now very rare that this stuff happens.
The next one is a thank you from Isabel Sherman. Thank you for your presentation. I am a young Czechoslovak National Cultural Ambassador, and it's been wonderful getting to learn more. Thank you. I had a chance to meet Isabel and vote on her at the Miss Czech and Slovak last year in Nebraska. So thank you for joining us, Isabel. Hopefully we'll see you more.
Thank you. Yeah, Joe, I was actually going to ask, how did you get, into this and presenting this and interested in the Slovak weddings between Slovakia and then immigrants here in the United States?
Oh, when I was very young, I was I studied history and got a bachelor's and a master's, and started a PhD program, but left. And I went to law school instead. And I would teach at a small college here at night in Pittsburgh. And I would teach history courses and East European things. And after I graduated law school, I started getting involved with Slovak community groups and things here in Pittsburgh. And people would ask me to talk about things, and I would draw on this pool of knowledge from the history days when I taught history.
Thank you.
So that's how it came to be. 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, I'm in my law office talking about wills and inheritances and things, and it's a different 9 to 5 world, but I like to go and share knowledge with people in the community of these kind of things. I think it's important to share the knowledge.
Yes, it is. Another comment from Ronald. It was in 1854 London when cholera was first proven tied to outhouses and contaminated groundwater from outhouses.
Yeah, I mean, it's a whole different world now. We can't even fathom,
Yep.
These kind of things. But in these rural villages, these people didn't have advanced educations, and it was a whole different world 100 and some years ago.
Yep. And then Ronald says again, Maria Theresa made sure her children were inoculated.
Ah, well, of course, she needs the next generation of royalty.
Yep. Well, that's it for the chat. So anybody wants to open the mic and ask questions or have comments? Don't be shy. I don't think Joe's in a hurry to go anywhere, right?
No, there's no hurry, so if you have a question you want to ask, feel free.
Hey Joe, this is
You
Madonna.
saved me from having to go home and do laundry or work in the garden. So the more questions, then it might be dark and I won't have to do gardening.
Oh, it will get dark, exactly.
Hey Joe, it's Madonna.
Thanks,
You
Madonna.
guys-
I'm
Yes,
sorry.
yeah.
Hi Joe, it's Madonna.
Yes.
We're from Perryopolis, down near
That's
Uniontown.
not far from here.
Yeah, exactly.
I went to high school in Connellsville, which is close to Perryopolis.
Yeah, and I went to high school in Geibel.
Yes, that's where I went to high school too.
What year?
I graduated in 1977.
Oh God, you're way behind me. I'm 1982. So anyway, the other thing is, I was surprised when I was doing some research on my grandfather that they actually came in through Baltimore, a lot of them.
Yes.
And I was shocked because I had always thought he came in through Ellis, but he came actually in through Baltimore. And I always wondered how we ended up in Star Junction, right? And he had on the manifest that he was supposed to be going to Chicago, but the two gentlemen below him were actually going to Star Junction, and they must have made friends and ended up in Star Junction, and that's where he stayed.
Yeah. See, when people came in those days, you didn't have like visas and passports like you have to have now. Those things came after 1924.
Okay.
Because by 1924, America really didn't want more of these immigrants. I mean, it was really kind of what was happening 1880 to 1920 was the same thing you have happening now. There was a lot of bad feelings to immigrants. The Ku Klux Klan was not just running around down in the South, they were running around in Pennsylvania, all over Pennsylvania, West Virginia. They were going to these immigrant areas. They were burning crosses, beating people, calling them job stealers, and basically they put in a quota system for immigrants and it started in 1924. But before that, all you needed was a letter of invitation, and you had to have the sum. Now, you'll laugh now, but in its day, $15 was a lot of money.
Yeah, he had 19.
A guy who worked in a factory could support a family of 6 on $4 a week. So the idea was you had to come and you had to have in hand $15 that guaranteed you that you could sustain yourself for a month or two once you arrived.
Okay.
And
that makes
so,
sense. He came in 1899 and he had $19.
yeah, so that, he had more than he needed to get in. You had to have the letter, you had to have the cash money, whether it was in gold or silver or American paper money, but you had to have the minimum amount of money, and you had to pass the physical exam at whatever port of entrance you had. And there were several ports. And it really just depended on your ship ticket, where you ended up. Like people's relatives would send them ship tickets, and you'd have to end up going to, like, for example, Hamburg or Bremen or one of these big seaports in Germany. And the ships had their routes and their destinations. And everybody thinks of Ellis Island, but the other big ports were Boston, Philadelphia. There was, I forget the name of the town, it was a town on the coast in Virginia. There was Charleston, South Carolina. And there was also New Orleans. A lot of Italians ended up going to New Orleans for some reason. It was just where the shipping companies were docking at these large scale ports. And so somehow a lot of the Irish ended up in Boston and Philadelphia, but a lot of Italians ended up in Philadelphia too. I remember years ago, when I was a kid, going to a family gathering, and somehow all the old timers were talking about the Statue of Liberty. And my grandfather said, well, I never saw it. And they're like, what do you mean? Everybody came through Ellis Island. He goes, no, my ship came to Baltimore. I never saw the Statue of Liberty.
Okay. Yeah.
So it just really depended what ticket you purchased for what shipping line, where you ended up disembarking. Because Ellis Island was the biggest of all these ports. To be honest with you, it was like they were a huge, huge facility in comparison to the others. But they didn't have a monopoly. You know, there were big numbers that were still coming to Boston and Philadelphia, for example, and Baltimore. But Ellis Island was maybe 3 or 4 times the size of the other destination immigrant ports.
Interesting. Well, go Gators.
That was our high school mascot for those who aren't in the know.
Yeah, we figured. Got another one from John. With so many Eastern European immigrants coming here to work in the coal mines and the steel mills, how did there come to be such a large Czech and Slovak community in Iowa that the museum is there?
They came for different reasons to the Midwest. A lot of the Czechs went to Iowa, Minnesota, Illinois, Missouri, and there's a huge number of them in Texas, because these were agricultural areas, and those people actually were coming even a little bit earlier than 1880. Like, for example, the Czech American Sokol was opening in St. Louis in the late 1860s or early 1870s. So there were already enough people there that they were actually doing Sokol sports. So, but those people were coming, and Nebraska is full of Czechs since the middle 1800s, because the American government was giving away free land in these really unpopulated areas like Nebraska and Kansas and South Dakota and North Dakota. And so a lot of people were coming from those areas. Somehow a lot of Scandinavians ended up in the Dakotas and Minnesota, but they all went there to get free land, and they were used to cold winters, which are terribly cold up in the Dakotas. But you know, that's how you had these big populations of Czechs. It was much more Czechs than Slovaks going to those places like Nebraska and Texas and Illinois and Iowa. You did have Czechs coming to these industrial cities, but in smaller numbers. The Czechs were coming here to work in glass factories because glass was already a big industry in the Czech kingdom from the Middle Ages. And they would blow glass, they would cut glass, you know, the designs into glass. And so a lot of these factory towns that had glass factories, Czechs would come to those places too.
And yes, and Isabel's mentioning, it's funny you asked that. So she is from Iowa. Many Czechs and Slovaks immigrated to Iowa because of the fertile farmland that was available. In the 70s, Czech immigrants founded the Czech Fine Arts Foundation. Over time, this turned into the National Czech and Slovak Museum that we know and love today.
Mm-hmm.
And John's also asking, is there a very large Polish community in Texas?
Well, I don't know about Texas, to be honest with you. There are more people there are as many people speaking Polish right now in Chicago as there are in Warsaw.
Yep.
And no, that's true. They get like 500,000 ballots, mail-in ballots from Chicago in Polish elections.
Okay.
It's sort of like the capital of Polish emigres, and other cities like Cleveland and Buffalo. Pittsburgh was a big center of immigration, not just for Slovaks. Slovaks were the biggest number of immigrants to the Pittsburgh region, to the tune of about 25% of all the emigration from Slovakia to America ended up within 100 miles of Pittsburgh.
Mm-hmm.
But for the Polish, there were large numbers of Polish here too, Ukrainians, Serbians, and the big center of Bulgarian immigration to America was, there was a steel factory town, maybe about 4 or 5 miles from Pittsburgh called Homestead. And that is the epicenter of immigration to America from Bulgaria. So people came, but it was sort of like they came because they knew somebody who was already here who could send them the letter to invite them to come here. Because you couldn't get in the door at the immigration ports on this side without having the letter and the cash money and passing the physical. So, it indirectly, it often just ended up that there were already some Slovaks here. And that's why people came to this place or that place, because you had somebody that could send you the invitation letter. And often people didn't stay in the place they started at. Like they would come, and then after some months or a year, they didn't like the work they were doing. They'd move to another town and do something else. And it was sort of like they wandered around a bunch. As an illustration, my grandparents on mom's side came first to a town called Cornwall, which was in central Pennsylvania, a little bit north of Harrisburg. And Cornwall had iron ore mines, and they had iron ore smelting factories. And there were a whole bunch of Slovaks from their region who were already working in the mines and the factories there. But after a while, my grandparents didn't like this work, and they moved to Johnstown, and they didn't like living the steel factory work in Johnstown, and they moved to, in the course of a few years, they went to 3 or 4 other different places till they finally ended up near the city of Latrobe, where they were happy and stayed. And grandma's sister came in the 1920s to the little town they were living in near Latrobe. And her sister didn't like it there. And she met this guy, and they got married, and they went to Detroit, and they worked in a car factory. It just, your initial destination wasn't necessarily going to be a forever destination for you. It was just kind of get your way to get into the country. And many times people didn't like where they initially landed, and they experimented around till they found some place they liked. And, and then it was all different an experience for them.
Yep. No other questions, but then John says, I seem to think that when Pope John Paul II came to America the first time, there was a move to try to persuade him to visit Texas due to a large Polish colony there. So that's why he thinks it's a lot of Polish in Texas. I'm sure they are.
It could be. I visited Texas a few times, but I went to see things like the Alamo and the San Antonio Riverwalk jazz clubs and stuff. So I have no idea. But there are a lot of Czechs in Texas because in many places you can get kolache, just like the kinds they're making even today with the sour cherries and things in Czech Republic. You can get Czech kolache everywhere in central Texas.
Yep. Any other questions? I don't want to hold anybody up.
Actually,
Yep.
if you want to see contemporary, this Katarina Yanechkova Walsh, she has some books out about her art, but it's interesting because of the culture shock between she as the Slovak, modern young emigre Slovak wife, and the Texas cowboy husband. And she has a website with her artwork too. Now she's doing a lot of work depicting her, being a young mother in America with 2 small little girls. But it's interesting to look at her art and see the culture shock that comes with living in a new culture too. And it's not just the husband's culture shock with her, it's sort of like things that she took for granted that everybody does or doesn't do in Slovakia
Yep.
aren't even here. And I remember a funny story from her. They go back and forth, they visit her family over there, and she was telling me the story once about how her husband dreads going to Bratislava because he can't find decent tacos. And yeah, right. This is the Texas experience. He can't get a decent taco in Bratislava. And
Oh, you don't go to Bratislava for tacos. You go for Bielecki. Come on.
well, that's right. But this is the Texas guy, right?
Yeah.
Oh, there's no decent tacos here. And they live, her parents live kind of like in the like in the far end of the city, and there's a streetcar line nearby where they stay, and the husband's always complaining about all this noise, and she's like, "What? That's just the streetcar."
Yeah.
Like to him, it's because they're out in the countryside in Corpus Christi, and there's nothing around, and he's like, "Oh, I can't stand all this noise." Right? It's culture shock, and it's very interesting seeing it from both perspectives. That's why I mention her, because this is sort of like the new version of like the 2020s wedding and marital life, but it's a new perspective yet.
Yep.
I mean, it blew her away that he didn't know how to use a washing machine. and wasn't interested. He said, "Oh, that you have to do all that." And she's like, "Hey, pal,
No, you
no,
gotta learn, man.
you got to learn now."
Yep. What if when they didn't have washing machines,
Yeah, I mean, it's that was it was interesting hearing her talk about the adjustment.
Mhm.
Actually, they had
Yeah.
actually met in Asia,
Okay.
in Singapore of all places, and then got connected and ended up getting married, and she came here. And that's when all this stuff about the adjustment started. But, imagine 100 years ago, it was the same thing. Everybody's in this new world, and everything is completely different from what you had experienced at home.
Yeah.
I mean, even the workplaces. Nobody had electrical lighting in rural Slovakia till the 30s. And they're working in factories. And the streets had lights in,
Yep.
it was like, imagine the culture shock from these people. Tall buildings,
Mhm.
streetcars, motor vehicles, cars, trucks, railroads. I mean, everything must have been such an enormous, like, oh, wow, kind of moment all the time the first few months somebody arrived here.
Yep. Anyone else with questions? It's a quiet audience today.
Well, if you want to keep me in mind, I have other talks for the
Oh, yeah.
future. If you want, I'll be happy to do it. Now that we know all the tech end of things,
Yeah, I know.
our audience doesn't know this. We had so many technical
I have
difficulties.
Madonna's recording it for me because they changed that too. I'm like, I can't. I have the button, but it doesn't say record.
Yeah, I mean, like we went through, things with getting the slideshow together, tech things, and then things with the dry run. We did a dry run, and then today, before I was having
iPhone
difficulty
problems.
getting in. So your audience, you need to be thankful to Marta and Helen for working so hard to make this possible, because
You
we
did the
had so
work.
many roadblocks to getting this live for all of you that these two ladies need a round of applause.
No worries. Thank you, Joe. You did the work. You did the talking for 2 hours.
I talk too much all the time, so.
That's a good thing, isn't it?
But no, really, Marta and Helen did. We had so many tech obstacles in the last couple of weeks. What these two ladies did was amazing to get this off the ground for you folks.
Thank you so much. Well, we're hoping Isabel can join us another day too for a conversation about Miss Czech and Slovak competitions in the US. Because
And
there's a lot
and
of
it was-
Czechs out there, but there's no Slovaks, so I need to bring it into the Slovak community.
It was
I
nice
actually-
to meet all of you, and here there's even someone that went to the same high school as me in
Exactly.
the audience. So what a small world.
Joe,
Yes,
were you
Isabel.
by chance at the Pittsburgh event in November?
There,
The University of Pittsburgh?
Did you go to
the Slovak Festival, yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, I noticed that there are a lot of Czechs that are into this, but there's not as many Slovaks. So that's
Yeah.
the goal for next.
That's for our next, yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
We need to bring these Slovak girls out from the hiding.
Ah,
We need to take a bus up from this area, Marta.
We need to go to Cleveland. We need to go to Pittsburgh. Yep.
Pittsburgh's
well,
closer.
just to share, it's a different audience here
Yeah.
because the Slovak consul used to do these debutante balls and things from the 1980s onwards, and they can't even get an audience anymore for that for a long time.
Yeah.
And some of these little church areas, like there used to be something like a Miss Slovakia contest at one of the Slovak churches in Uniontown, and that fell by the wayside in the 80s. It's sort of like, I don't know if it's the culture here is a bit different, but it's not what it used to be. They're looking at different things now.
Yeah, when Isabel was running for Miss Czechoslovak in last year, out of 9 ladies, 1 had Slovak background. 1.
Well, it could just be,
Maybe.
it's like I see my niece and my nephew, and they're like, we want to do like our generation things.
Yep.
It could be something as simple as that
Maybe.
they're doing other things. It's hard to say.
Yeah. Anything
I
else?
reconstruct the past, right? I'm doing different things from a lot of people too.